Her 9000's Game Room.
People talk about the great console wars, Nintendo versus Sega, the Super Nintendo versus the Mega Drive, or the Sega Genesis as it's known in America. But here in the UK there was a great nerd civil war before most of us had even really woken up to the idea of cartridge-based gaming. What was this, you might ask? It was Spectrum versus Commodore. Wits, statistics and even fists were sometimes thrown trying to defend one side. It was like politics before we were old enough to understand who Labour and the Conservatives were. And if you carry on the analogy, then that would mean that the BBC was the home computer version of the Liberal Democrats. Third place without much of a chance or many people giving a toss really. The BBC's biggest advantage as an item of coolness was the fact that it was in our classrooms. I can remember classes of 30 children all sat on some god-awful itchy carpet, our heads almost touching, as we all leaned left and right to get a view of the screen. In truth, I don't know why we bothered. Most of the time, all that was on the screen was a bunch of words that our teacher would proceed to read to us. It would always be something like, "You are in a large, dark cave, the air smells, the ground beneath your feet feels slimy, the witch is coming for you, what do you want to do?" We would all then shout out stuff to the teacher, who would tend to go with what the majority said, which would be something like "go north," and you'd be met with either "you cannot go north," or "you have gone north, now what?" Or every now and then someone would get the bright idea to shout something along the lines of "turn round and fuck her to death." The whole class would laugh, even though only a certain percentage of us even had any idea what that meant. The bright spark would be sent out of the room along with anyone who couldn't stop themselves from laughing, and the BBC would be turned off and we would go back to book learning. Thinking back on it, I really should have done that kind of thing less often. Even though the BBC had its own killer title that most of us would have pulled our own teeth out to play Elite, most of us in my day and age didn't know about that, as it wasn't the kind of thing schools would get in. I was lucky as my brother, who's about 10 years older than me, decided to buy a BBC and Elite and I got to play it. But the BBC was never my machine. Consequently, as most of us had only seen text-based titles in a school environment, the BBC Micro had a real image problem, as the sort of grey boring middle-class home computer aimed at intellectuals and people who wanted to learn, and what we really wanted to do was have lots of fun. In nearly all my friends' either bedrooms or back rooms there was a Commodore 64 or a 48K Spectrum. So was I Team Commodore or Team Clive Sinclair? I was Team Spectrum, and you know why? Basically because at the age of 2 or so I was slapped in front of my brothers with bright characters flashing, encouraged to slap on the buttons. Was this because my parents were awful terrible people looking to have some form of computerised overlord babysit for them? No. The reason was much more mundane and well nice than this. My parents basically figured that the way things were going with technology, one day if you couldn't use a computer you would basically be unemployable. They figured if I grew up with computers being an everyday thing I'd seen and touched more or less from the moment my memories started forming, then I'd be ahead of the pack in some way. They wanted the best for me. They didn't slap me in front of my brother's games and let me shoot things just to keep me quiet. No, they went out of their way and spent a healthy amount on educational software. The one I remember the most starred the Mr. Men. It tried to teach you basic things like how to count and how to recognise colours. Eventually, when my brothers were both older than me and had moved on to other things, the Spectrum became mine, and it was primarily a games machine to me. I also, though, basically being the biggest gamer in the family, also inherited the family Atari 2600, my first kart-based machine. Where Atari might have been instant, though, the Spectrum had much more advanced games. They were also much easier to find and cheaper to buy. I was basically lovingly indoctrinated into the family of the Sinclair Spectrum. I liked it because it was made by a British man who seemed like a bit of a cool, mad scientist. I liked it because not only did I get all my brother's games, but our local newsagent and even our local Boots the Chemist sold games very cheaply for it. There was also the fact that my very closest friend had one, and this tied us even deeper together of friends with a common cause, but the main reason I liked it was because it was all I had. All I could afford, and I just plain did not want to believe that something out there I couldn't have was or could be better than what was sat in my bedroom on my glorious black and white 8-inch TV. I was very young when I had a Spectrum. I didn't have the skills at that point in time to sit back and look at the big picture, or even to have a rational argument. My first arguments about the machine were in infant school, age 5 after all. An infant school in a small mining town where the language was as dark as the pits. So when a 5-year-old boy would tell me that I was scum because I had a Spectrum, which was rubbish compared to his Commodore, my only real course of action was to call him a puff or a spastic, with no knowledge of what these words meant, only knowing I'd heard other people say them, older people, and that they were in some way offensive. The playground was often a battlefield, with the Spectrum lad kicking a Commodore lover and then the resulting retaliation. This was long before comprehensive and the thankfully far more peaceful console wars. Back in those days, hearts were broken and lunchboxes shattered over kids' heads, and all in the name of one computer or another, which is now painfully underpowered compared to even the most basic of budget phones. And yet, in amongst all of the violence and arguments, there was always a bleeping, screaming, cassette-playing computer to go home to. It's Kerr9000 signing off, saying keep on gaming.